have you ever sat down to kind of watch something or read something, and you find yourself thinking a whole lot about things that don't really have anything directly to do with what you're reading or what you're hearing? That sort of thing happens to me a lot, actually. And this particular week, this past week, I was reading and I was thinking about how often information is misapplied. That it's not necessarily malicious, it's just that someone doesn't necessarily know the context of something and they misapply it. And now, for me, I happen to be reading the Bible, but this can happen with kind of any kind of resource. But as I was reading along, I came along to this text. So we're blessed to give than to receive. Now, if someone says that to you, hey, it's we're blessed to give than receive, what do they want from you? They want money, right? And what I always find really funny about that is when people say it's more blessed to give than receive, it's usually the guy receiving the money who says that. But it turns out that text actually doesn't have anything to do with money. It's actually quoting Paul as Paul is quoting Jesus. But it is pretty easy to make it seem like it's money, but it's not really about that, right? It's not what we think. Because if you look at the full context of what Paul is saying, he's actually addressing a church that he's been at for a few years. And what Paul says is that in everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak. Remembering the words the Lord Jesus himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. So Paul's not talking about money at all. Right? What Paul is talking about is about serving others, about helping others, particularly those who are in need. Now, as he talks about helping the weak, that might involve money. We do need resources to do things, but that is certainly not his focus. Paul's point here is that a meaningful life, a healthy life, a life that is anchored in God's leading is a life that focuses on and involves helping other people. So if the text has nothing to do with money, what's going on there? Right? This is a case of someone misapplying that text. Now, it's certainly possible that someone is doing that in a malicious way. They're actually intentionally misapplying it. But I think also it's very likely that someone might just kind of misunderstand. If you just look at it on the surface, that seems to kind of make sense, right? It's more blessed to give than to receive. And I think about this issue of kind of misunderstanding how something works, how something comes together, misunderstanding how we can use something to achieve an outcome, right? In this case, it's words and text, but I think we do that in life often. That as we're trying to achieve things, as we're trying to get to some point in our lives, we start to try to use things that we think are going to help us get there. And sometimes, because we don't have the full context of how all the pieces come together, that can cause us to try to use tools to reach a goal that might not get us there. So this week, as we wrap up our series that we've been in for the past few weeks, Healing What Hurts, I want to look at this idea of kind of understanding how to apply the things that we need to. Now remember that throughout this series, what we've really been looking at is what I believe is a fundamental truth. That virtually all of us, no matter what our age is, carry some kind of hurt or pain from our past. Someone who's mistreated us. It might be abuse. It might be other difficulties. It might just be a really challenging thing in our lives. It might be a loss that we've experienced. Those hurts kind of anchor in our hearts in some way. And those hurts begin to travel with us. And so if we're going to actually heal from those things, there are steps we need to follow. And that's what we've been looking at throughout the series, is this kind of series of steps that we can take to experience that healing. But much of what we really looked at in the series is how those hurts, how that pain affects our behavior. That if we can kind of understand how those hurts and those pains, those emotional hurts, those emotional pains affect our behavior, we can start to understand that relationship between our hurts and our actions, and that can help us heal. So this week, as we wrap up, I'd like to look at a couple of things. One is something else that we might want to let go of. In fact, I would encourage us to let go of. But also, as we finish, I want to look at specific actions that we can take that can really help us kind of live a more full life, to really start to kind of break free more completely from the hurts and our pains. Now, one of the things that I think is kind of a simple truth in life. Life involves discomfort. Right? There are times in our lives that we experience discomfort. And whenever we experience discomfort, what do we want to do? Well, we want to eliminate that discomfort. We want to get free from that discomfort. And what we find is that when we are carrying our hurts and our pains around with us, that magnifies our discomfort. And what I have found is that when we're experiencing those things, kind of a natural side effect is we start to feel dissatisfied. We start to feel dissatisfied with our life. We start to feel dissatisfied with the story that our life is writing, that it's not quite building the story we want it to. So we start looking for ways to address that. What can we do to fix it? And what will often happen, I think, is that we become very focused on trying to modify that story. We want to try to build that story up. If I could just fix the story, I'd feel better. Because if I have a better story, I will feel better. I will feel free from the pains that I have. So we start pursuing things that we believe will eliminate our discomfort. We start pursuing things that we believe will give us a better story. Because if I have a more impressive story, then I'll be better, right? That'll make me feel better, right? But when it comes to the things we pursue to help us feel better, in general, I think it's not what we think. That the things that we tend to reach for, that we think will actually make us feel better, rarely do. I mean, if we're dissatisfied with our life, particularly if we're young, when we're young, if we're dissatisfied with our life, what is kind of the default solution? More money, right? Man, if I had more money, I'd be set, right? Because I have more money, then everything would be cool, right? Because I could get a bigger house, I'd get a nicer car, I'd be more important, I'd have status, and things like that might make us feel better for a little bit. I mean, I've bought cars I couldn't afford. I didn't feel better, right? We do those things, hoping that they will. So, if things like that don't actually make us feel better, then what do? As I mentioned, there's one thing I think we can let go of, and one thing we can add. And what I want to do to kind of go through that is, rather than take my advice on that stuff, I want to look at something that Jesus says about all this. And what's kind of interesting is that as we look at what Jesus talks about, it won't at first seem like it has anything to do with what we're talking about. But because Jesus is such a rich, powerful speaker, he's able to kind of take us in one direction and then kind of get our minds to where he really wants us to consider things. Because I believe that his advice in what we're about to go through is critical to experiencing deep, lasting healing. That if we will take all the steps we've talked about throughout this series, and then kind of wrap up on what Jesus tells us today, I think that puts us on a road to starting to really heal from all those things. So let's take a look at what Jesus says here. He says, "No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money." So Jesus is saying all money is bad, right? No, I know. I've had money and I've not had money. Having money's better, right? Sort of thing. Right? So that's not what it's about. Right? He's talking about relationship with money. Right? He's talking about, where does money fall into our life, into our decision process? Because notice the word he uses to describe the relationship with money. Enslaved. If you're enslaved to someone, if you're enslaved to something, it owns you. It's what makes the decisions for you, right? If you're enslaved, you do not have autonomy. You do not make your own decisions. Your decisions are driven by the thing that owns you. So Jesus has chosen those words really, really specifically. He's saying this is the unhealthy pursuit of money. It may be that big car or that big house or whatever it is that kind of, gets us excited, But it's not just the pursuit of material things that can cause us to have an unhealthy relationship with money. Because we also look to money for something else, our safety and our security. That we can start to think that if I just have enough money, then I'll be secure, then I'll be okay. If I just have enough. But of course, the next question is, well, what's enough? The answer is always the same. More. And that's when we start to become enslaved to it. That's when it starts to drive us. Now, to be super clear here, right, that Jesus is not saying that having resources is a bad thing. He's not saying that, we shouldn't work, right? Of course, it's important to be productive and to use our abilities to do things that are meaningful. Of course, we have to earn a living. We certainly should be good stewards of our resources. And, we should save for the future, right? Those sort of things are good. Those sort of things are healthy. But what Jesus is talking about here is that when we focus on that too much, when that focus becomes too big a part of our lives, he says that when that happens, it displaces the role of God in our lives. That we start to look to our resources for security as opposed to God for our security. We start to look for what the resources will do for us as opposed to what we can do in step with God. That we can start to believe that, one day I'll think about how I can be there for other people, take care of people, but I got to get enough money first. That I start putting things off that I should be doing because I'm so focused on money. That we become so focused on that idea that we miss the opportunity to have an impact with our lives, to actually do things throughout our lives to help us impact other people's lives. Because what Jesus is really warning us about here, that when we start to become very focused on these sort of things, as we start to think about this unhealthy relationship with money, as we start to think about this unhealthy relationship with where we find security or material things that we're looking for, he says something's going to start to happen. He's actually pointing out to us that it's going to actually start to make us worry, right? Because if we're not careful, focusing on money will lead to worry. And this is a really easy test. I can do this for any of us. Have you ever had an account, a financial account of any sort? You had a savings account. Have you ever had a 401k, an IRA, an investment account? Well, when you have a savings account, if you take money out of it every day, does that make you feel secure? Or do you start to look and say, wow, it's kind of getting smaller? Or if you have an investment accounts are kind of the worst, right? IRAs, 401ks. The best thing to do with an IRA or 401k is check it every day, right? Because that way I can be super excited that my balance went down $100 yesterday, right? Or the opposite. It's going up, but it only went up $100 last month. That gives you security, right? That makes you feel better, right? What happens is that kind of focus causes us to worry. The thing that we believe is going to give us security. Because why are we looking at it every day? Because we're trying to find security in what we see there. Again, we should save for the future, right? We should, as much as we can, prepare for the future and put things aside. But we don't lean on it. It's not the source of our security. As soon as we think it's the source of our security, it becomes the foundation of our worry. Jesus puts it like this. That is why I tell you not to worry about everyday life, whether you have enough food and drink or enough clothes to wear. Isn't life more than food and your body more than clothing? Now, to be really clear, Jesus is not scolding us for worrying. Right? Jesus understands that we struggle from time to time. That's why he's talking about it. He knows that throughout life, this concept of worry is something that's going to grab a hold of us. So he's addressing that issue. And as we look at this idea of, not worrying about whether you have enough food and drink and clothes and, isn't life more than food and your body more than clothing? If we read that literally, that gets kind of confusing. But remember that Jesus is a very powerful, talented speaker. And he knows how to use words to achieve an outcome. He knows how to use words to get our attention. So what's he doing? He's using hyperbole, right? He's using extreme statements to get the listener's attention. So basically what he's saying here is not that, well, you don't need food and clothing, just relax. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that when you've got what you need, don't keep striving for more, right? Don't get so focused on what money gives. Don't get so worried about what money gives. Don't get so focused on what money can give you that you miss what money can never give you. Don't lose sight of where our attention needs to be. And then as Jesus talks about this idea of worry, he presents the central question. As we're worrying, can all your worries add a single moment to your life? In fact, with what we know about medical science now, what does worrying do to your life? Shortens your life. Your blood pressure goes up, your heart gets taxed, you kind of tax those artery walls. Worry's awesome, right? Yet I know people who worry like it's a profession, right? That it's easy to become very consumed with worry. And I'm not making fun of anyone. I'm simply saying that, to be clear, I worry too. I try not to, but I do. Because we all do sometimes. And Jesus is saying that, think about what's happening to you. Not to scold us, but just think about what's happening to you when you let worry dominate your mind, when you let worry dominate your decision. As worry fills our lives, it takes so much from us, yet it gives us nothing in return. So what Jesus is doing here is inviting us to refocus our attention. He basically points out that there is something we can do. That there's something we can actually look around. And we can actually look around and see that God is at work, not just in our lives, but in the world around us. And he actually does that by talking about nature. And he actually talks a bit about the things we see in nature. And as he kind of wraps up that point, we kind of reach this verse. And if God cares so wonderfully for wildflowers that are here today and thrown into the fire tomorrow, he will certainly care for you. Why do you have so little faith? Now, it might sound like Jesus is kind of chastising us here. Why do you have so little faith? Kind of church lady sort of thing. But I don't think that's what he's doing. Jesus is inviting us to ask ourselves that question. He's actually prompts us a bit. And notice that he's not saying, hey, you need to have blind faith and just do what you're told. He says, no, just ask yourself, why do you have so little faith? And I make this point about blind faith because he's not saying, just trust me. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, look around. You've actually seen evidence of God. And where does he start? He starts with the beauty of nature. The verses before this talk about birds and lilies and that sort of thing. And then in this verse, it talks about wildflowers. He says, look at the amazing thing that God is doing in that. I mean, just yourselves, watch the interaction of wildlife around your homes, right? We live in a place where we get to see lots of wildlife, and I love watching the birds, but I also love watching the bobcats stalk the birds, right? There's just kind of amazing things that God pulls together and all that. And Jesus is saying that that's what God does for them, and you are worth so much more to me than they are. So if that's my handiwork that you can see in nature, Jesus is saying that, okay, if that's God's handiwork in nature, what handiwork is God doing in your life? Was there ever a time that you prayed for something and that prayer was answered? That's God's handiwork. Was there ever a time where things seemed so hopeless, but somehow you kind of made it a little further than you thought you would? You got to another side when you thought you wouldn't? That's God's handiwork. That's God caring for us. But there is a challenging side to this, because notice that Jesus says that God will care for us. In other words, he will give us what we need. He doesn't say that God will give us what we want, which is kind of disappointing, right? Because I want him to give me what I want, but I seem to get what I need sometimes. And it's not a promise that life will not be hard. It is not a promise that we will never experience loss. It's not a promise that we will never experience sadness. But it is a promise that there's always hope. That if we put our faith in Jesus, even as we leave this life, there's hope. And it doesn't mean that we're never sad. It doesn't mean we're never afraid. And it doesn't mean that things always work out the way we want them to. But if we think back to some of the hardest things we've experienced, and I know some of you have experienced incredibly hard things, as we get to the other side, somehow we do go on, and over time, we seem to find the things we need. That's God's handiwork. And so Jesus is saying that just stop, look around. First, look around at what you see in the world around you, but then look in your own life. And what have you seen in your own life? What handiwork of God's have you seen in your own life? Well, God is unchanging. So God was there for you in that past. He cared for you throughout your past. He will also come through in the future. He will also come through in the future. So look to the future with confidence. Again, not saying it will be easy, but look to the future with confidence. And now Jesus does not expect us to suddenly have 100% confidence. He knows that life is challenging. He's simply saying, begin to develop that confidence, to be consciously aware of what you see happening. And so as you see God move and God's handiwork in your life, say, wow, I still see that happening. That gives me confidence. And as we develop that confidence, that's when we can start to take that next step in healing from those emotional hurts and those emotional pains. Because we can stop chasing those things that we think will make us feel better, but that we keep learning don't actually make us feel better. We can begin pursuing the things that actually do help us feel better. And Jesus tells us what that is. Jesus says, seek the kingdom of God above all else. Live righteously, and God will give you everything you need. So Jesus is saying that the way that we take that next phase of healing, and remember that all these things we've talked about work together, right? We kind of talked about a lot of things the past few weeks, but as we come along that process, that if we actually embrace this idea of not chasing things that keep letting us down, but instead embrace what God is doing in your life, right? Be who you were created to be, right? This is the drum I have been beating since Christmas Eve, right? I think every sermon, if I'm not mistaken, every single message since Christmas Eve, I invite us to make an effort to be in step with who you are, to stop trying to conform to what other people want from you. Right? It doesn't mean we're not responsible. I'm simply saying that be the person you're created to be. Because you are uniquely created. You have unique abilities. You have unique opportunities. When you bring those things together, you can do things that no one else will ever do the way that you will do them. What that means, my friends, is that God has a call on your life. You are called to do something. And if you look up the word call in Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it says that it is a divine vocation. That it's not just me who has that. Every one of us have that. Now, I know that this idea of having a call can sound scary, because the first thing, as soon as you hear that, what pops into your mind? Am I supposed to quit my job, move to Africa, and open an orphanage? Well, maybe, but probably not. I mean, some people quit their jobs, or kind of called to quit their jobs. I do know a person who actually moved to Africa and started an orphanage. But I don't think that's true for most of us. What's true for most of us is to bloom where you're planted, right? You are where you are for a purpose, right? That you have opportunities to do things that I won't have, that other people don't have. And that if we will actually use those opportunities, use the resources we have, be willing to invest in others' lives to change lives, that's answering our call. And that is unique to each and every one of us. And as we look around, we can often kind of cast doubt on ourselves. Kind of that question of, well, if I'm supposed to change lives, I mean, I don't really interact with that many people. How am I supposed to change lives? But it's important to understand that some people are called to affect many, many lives. But most of us are called to focus on a few lives. Those that are kind of in our, what we call our circle of influence, right? Those people we encounter that God is calling us to live out his love and his light inside of us, to serve the people that come through our lives. But what I will remind all of us is that we can all achieve far more than we think we can. That we shouldn't set our sights too low, that we should stretch ourselves, that we should reach for things that seem too hard, that we should try to do things that we can't do alone, that we can only achieve if God is in it with us. So be bold. And I would encourage each of us to ask ourselves a question. What is God calling me to do? In this moment, what is God calling me to do? And then do it. You'll probably have to start slow. You'll step into it. And you know what? You're going to get tons of things wrong. And that's part of the plan too. Because we often think that the things we undertake are about succeeding in them. But God's definition of success is not always the same as our definition of success. Some things help us grow. Some things help us give us new perspectives. Sometimes we're in a place for a time, and then we're called somewhere else. And as we respond to that call in our lives, it's not always easy. It's often really hard. It's often really scary. And sometimes you have to make sad decisions. But as we pursue God's call on our lives, we can do it with confidence because he is leading us through it. Because Jesus makes a promise to us. Now, I'll admit, before I even read it, it doesn't really feel like a promise when you first hear it, but stay with me. Jesus says, so don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will bring its own worries. Today's trouble is enough for today. It sounds like it's kind of a mess. It's like, wait a minute. I thought it was supposed to get better. No, it's challenging. Life is challenging. Tomorrow is challenging. Today is challenging. But you know what? If we focus on tomorrow's challenges before we deal with today's challenges, they both get a lot worse. The promise here is what brings it all together. That it's about being in this day, right? In order to live well, to experience the life that we can have and achieve all that we can have in life, is that we need to focus on making today the best day that it can be. Address what needs to be done today, deal with the issues of today, and then ask a question. What can I do today that will make life better? What can I do today that will make my life better? But also, what can I do today that will make someone else's life better? Because as challenging as life can be, life is filled with joy if we look for it. And I think Jesus is really, as he points to this, don't worry about tomorrow's trouble. Again, it doesn't mean don't plan for tomorrow, but just don't obsess over tomorrow. That if we will focus on today, we can begin to embrace the joys of today. So what I would encourage all of us is each day to embrace the joys of the day, right? Eat those foods you like eating, right? To have those experiences that make you happy, to spend time with people you love. All those things are so important to healing. Yes, we work hard when it's appropriate and we plan for the future, but again, we don't obsess over the future. We just plan smartly. And I truly believe that in conjunction with what Jesus says here, an essential part of finding greater comfort in our lives, of actually experiencing lasting healing in our lives, is to live out that text that I opened with, but live it out in its true context. It's more blessed to give than to receive. That real, lasting healing in our lives occurs only when we look past our own lives, that we're not so busy looking inward that we never look outward. Yes, we should certainly evaluate ourselves, but we can get so stuck in our own issues that we never look at the world around us. We never look at what we can do in the world around us. That we only experience true healing when part of our lives involves investing in other people. Because, my friends, we are all called to help relieve suffering around us. And if you're a Jesus follower, we are all called to help people find life in Jesus. Because, my friends, it is only in service to one another that we truly live all the goodness that life has to offer. It's only in service to one another that we start to gain perspective about life and what's going on in other people's lives. And we start to realize that, yes, we have problems, but other people do too. And that somehow by serving other people, we can take our eyes off our own hurts for a bit. We don't ignore them. We go through a process of healing. But part of that healing is investing in others. That our own healing becomes more complete. We care for and invest in other people.